So there's another response I'm a little more sympathetic to, which suggests it's not at all surprising that this is how, in fact, these basic parameters are. And I think Michael wants to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay, so Bill kind of touched on how it's not surprising in an atheistic worldview that there is fine-tuning. Another response would be that actually deny the fine-tuning altogether. I'm actually more sympathetic to what Bill was talking about, but just another response is basically, you know, you can find fine-tuning in anything depending on how you set the parameters. An example to clarify this would be, you know, if I ask you, is a cloudy day fine-tuned? Or outside, go outside and look up and there's clouds in the sky, be cloudy. Is that fine-tuned? You'd probably say, well, no. Many days are cloudy. Some days it's hot, some days it's cold. Humidity can be, you know, different you know, levels. So it's coarse-tuned. You wouldn't say it's fine-tuned. However, if I then say, you know, well, actually, you know, you set the parameters of temperature to infinity on each end. So the temperature could be negative infinity or, you know, infinity degrees hot or cold, basically. Then it looks fine-tuned. Same thing with humidity, other factors. Well, now a cloudy day looks very fine-tuned. So perhaps the way this relates back to, you know, the laws of nature in the universe, the gravitational constant appears to be fine-tuned. Yes, it appears to be fine-tuned if the parameters are wide enough, but we don't even know what the parameters are. There's no way to know, or at least we don't know at this point. So they're pointing out that there's fine-tuning and it exists by assuming the parameters could have been practically anything. The gravitational constant could have been 1 billion times less or 1 billion times more, but that's not necessarily true. We don't really know that. So one way to go about this is just really point out we don't really know the universe is fine-tuned. That's another response.
Okay, do you guys have a response for that? Do those make it sound to you like this isn't actually an embarrassment, or do you still think it's more likely that there is fine-tuning and that points to an intelligence?
I think that there's still fine-tuning to be reckoned with. Again, this isn't my opinion or Jordan's. A large number of physicists have looked at the evidence and they think it's fine-tuning. Now, don't be mistaken by the phrase fine-tuning. That doesn't mean design, okay, as they were pointing out. Now, just a couple of things here. Now, Bill had said that the odds of life forming in this solar system are pretty good, given that we have billions of solar systems. Well, that would be like explaining, if we're all playing a hand of poker and someone keeps getting dealt a royal flush, and then that person says, well, I keep getting dealt a royal flush because look at all the people in the room. Eventually, this is going to happen, given the parameters here. So I think that that's actually ultimately false. He brought up the multiverse scenario. I'd be interested in knowing exactly which one he has in mind. There's one that's very promising, proposed by Alexander Vilenkin, but there are some metaphysical problems associated with that particular interpretation. And it seems like it's every bit as speculative as belief in God. Now, what about this idea that there's actually nothing to explain? I heard it sort of invoke the anthropic principle. John Leslie gave an example as well with respect to the anthropic principle, which is to say that where observers are present, it's not surprising that they would see the parameters of the universe exactly as they are, fit for life. But you see, that's, again, the same sort of scenario. Leslie imagines, that if you're standing in front of a firing squad, and they're aiming their rifles at you, and that they all suddenly miss and you're alive, that it's somehow a satisfactory explanation to say that, well, because I'm observing being alive, that's the explanation why I'm here. You see, that seems rather unsatisfactory. There must be an explanation for why you're here as opposed to not. And Michael had mentioned something about what sort of parameters are, we have a possibly infinite number of parameters. Well, this gets into a controversial aspect of probability. Some have suggested, like the McGrews and Vestra, they offer this particular view. They say, look, you've got to normalize this. You have to understand that the parameters out of which the probabilities are taken could be infinite. But I'm just going to briefly say that I find that implausible only because that's not how the world works. Take, for example, the famous Tristram Shandy paradox, where you're writing a biography so slow that it takes you 1 year to complete 1 day. And the longer you write, the more you fall behind. However, arrive at infinity, you'll have written on an infinite number of days. And so the two will be equal, and that distance somehow becomes bridged, and there is no disconnect. And I just find that implausible.
Okay, unless there's a point you guys really want to address, we can move on to the next question.
Just briefly, yes, you mentioned that I suggested that the large number of universes or solar systems explains why we're in this specific solar system universe. That's actually not what I suggested. And insofar as sometimes people use the anthropic principle in that way, I agree with you that that's a mistake. The point is simply to take your poker game example. If you do indeed have 1 million people in a room playing millions and millions and millions and millions of hands of poker, then it is not surprising that one of them will actually get a royal flush. So too, if you have millions of solar systems and if you have millions of universes, it's not at all surprising that one of them would in fact have the parameters that this one has. Now, if the question is, but why did this particular universe, why is it the one that we wound up in? I think that's just a bad question. There's not an answer to it. Of course, if in fact there is a universe that is fine-tuned in that way, and life does evolve in that universe, then the creatures in such a universe will ask the kinds of questions we're asking tonight. So you would expect exactly that kind of thing to happen. I'll just stop there.
Okay.
Time to respond, or we move on.
What's that?
Time to respond, or we move on.
If you would really like to, I won't stop you.
I was just going to say some of the parameters are about the universe itself, of which all of the solar systems are contained therein. Yes.
Okay. All right. And we can move on to our next question. You guys have another question?
Yeah, this is actually a question I'd like to introduce as sort of a question in memory of a really famous and important philosopher named David Lewis, who just recently passed away at Princeton a few years ago. He's probably one of the smartest people to live in the last 100 years. And this is actually David Lewis's question that he raised just before he passed away. So a standard paradigm, when we ask ourselves, what is evil? A standard paradigm that comes to mind is Hitler, right? Whenever people talk about evil and really bad people, it's always Hitler and the Nazis. And if you ask yourself, well, what really was it about Hitler and the Nazis that made them so evil? What was so bad about them? It seems like one obvious answer was their treatment of the Jews, right? That they tormented their Jews and they murdered the Jews, and they did so just because they were Jewish, right? So we regard that as a paradigm of evil. But according to many Christians, and then certainly the Orthodox Christian perspective, the suffering that Hitler inflicted on Jews is in fact nothing compared to what the Christian God is currently doing to those very same Jews, right? Even if you think that is in some way immoral to not be a Christian, isn't the punishment of eternal damnation a kind of extreme torture beyond our comprehension, out of proportion to the quote-unquote crime of being Jewish? I mean, if Hitler was grossly unjust and grossly immoral to kill Jews just because they were Jewish, isn't a Christian God even more unjust for torturing them for eternity just because they didn't worship him in the appropriate manner? Insofar, in fact, I mean, here's sort of the challenging question that Lewis raised.